The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.
Obama's decision to go around Congress and use executive action to do things like raise the minimum wage for federal contractors may not seem like the end of the world, but in the right-wing clown car, it came close. Ted Cruz wrote in the Wall Street Journal, quote, "Of all the troubling aspects of the Obama presidency, none is more dangerous than the president's persistent pattern of lawlessness. His willingness to disregard the written law and instead enforce his own policies via executive fiat." Marco Rubio called it borderline unconstitutional. Congressman Randy Weber tweeted about the socialistic dictator. Steve Stockman took it a step further, walking out of the State of the Union and later saying, quote, "I could not bear to watch as he continued to cross the clearly defined boundaries of the constitutional separation of powers." His colleague Michelle Bachmann told reporters, quote, "He's the president of the United States. He's not a king. He may think he's a king. He may declare himself king, but that's not what he is under our Constitution." And Tim Muellskamp echoed her, tweeting, quote, "First release of Obama's speech reads like dictates from a king." My colleague Rachel Maddow called him out on that one.
The release of the speech reads like dictates from a king. Hashtag
really
lawless.
does.
What did he say in the speech that was lawless tonight?
14 different points in where the president said, "I don't like the American people who they elect." That's what the president was saying. He said, "I don't like Congress. I don't like the American people that sent these people up here." And so he listed 14 different dictates, executive orders. Yes.
Are
that he was
executive
going to
orders
take.
lawless?
An executive action without authority is lawlessness.
Executive
he did not
orders
have the
by
authority
presidents are lawless?
if there is no authority.
Well, why is the right wing freaking out over the president issuing a series of relatively modest executive actions, something he is far from the first president to do? Well, sadly, it fits a pattern from the right in dealing with this president, of course, and calling into question, as they often do, his legitimacy. Dana Milbank's a columnist for the Washington Post, and Sam Stein's a political editor for the Huffington Post. Dana, this word lawless seems to lawlessness like he's some cowboy maverick out there in the saddle somewhere, breaking the law, shooting up the town. Where did the word lawless first originate? I think it's a second-term birtherism. He was illegitimately elected. Now he's behaving illegitimately. This goes back to the whole notion that the right has. They want to put an asterisk next to this guy. He really wasn't a law-abiding or even legally, legitimately elected president. Your thoughts, your own thoughts.
I think what's going on here is this is one of those episodes when it flares up, Chris, and the Republicans from the very beginning have been seeking to discredit Obama, not saying we disagree with his policies, but to say this guy is bad, this guy is other, this guy is something else. There's been this sort of latent Obama derangement syndrome. The virus remains in the blood, and it just seems to flare up from time to time. But it's not necessarily something they're calculating. I think it's just there's some sort of reflexive hatred that drives us from time to time.
Let me go to Sam on this, because maybe you don't agree, but I see these words as unusual in the American discourse. Certainly, we've had our red baiting periods and all that in the 50s and earlier, and we've had all kinds of periods of use of the word corrupt. That was a big Newt Gingrich. Jim Wright was corrupt. These terms seem so third world in their over-the-topness, the kinds of things you hear in countries a lot less stable than this one. Your thoughts?
Well, I agree with you in part, but I think it's actually a little bit more an excuse of convenience for the Republican Party. What they are saying and what they've done is they said, well, this is such an imperial presidency that we cannot trust him or we cannot pass policies because he will then change it. If you look at any of the excuses that they've given recently for their unwillingness, for instance, to pass immigration reform, it always comes down to, well, we can't trust the president to enforce the laws that we pass because he is an imperial presidency. He makes the laws as he sees fit. And so it's an excuse of convenience in some respects for Republicans to accuse him of being above the law because it excuses them from doing anything legislatively.
Well, the president was asked about the right-wing reaction in an interview on CNN. Here's what he said.
Well, I don't think that's very serious. The truth of the matter is that every president engages in executive actions. In fact, we've been very disciplined and sparing in terms of the executive actions that we've taken. We make sure that we're doing it within the authority that we have under statute, but I'm not going to make an apology for saying that if I can help middle-class families and folks who are working hard to try to get in the middle class do a little bit better, then I'm going to do it.
What we're talking about here isn't exactly a power grab. The White House issued a list of 12 executive actions the president plans on taking this year. They include, as I said, raising the minimum wage for federal contract workers, as I've said, creating a new savings account to help workers prepare for retirement, convening a meeting with CEOs in the country to try and figure out a solution for long-term unemployment, and setting new fuel efficiency standards for trucks. Back to you, Dana. I think there is something here that goes out there to people on the, not necessarily the fringe, but the ideological people in the Republican Party who vote in the primaries, especially in the caucuses. This notion that the federal government is out of control, that there's a 10th Amendment that's been ignored, that the government is grabbing power that hasn't been there before, and that somehow we better be scared in River City. And this seems to be based upon ideology rather than events or even behaviors of the president. They grab at these behaviors, but they really believed this long before he ever came into office, and now they're using him as the worst-case scenario.
Right. It feeds into that paranoia, and it also has the effect of shutting down debate. In that clip you played of Tim Holzkamp, he couldn't come up with anything that he thought was lawless, but once you call the guy a dictator, it's like when you compare your opponent to Hitler, it shuts down the debate. They don't have to have the argument. So, look, we can point out that this president has made fewer executive orders than George W. Bush did, than Ronald Reagan did, and we can also point out that the reason he's doing these small executive actions is because he had the Congress isn't willing to pass anything. But we're not going to have that debate because it's the idea of saying, we're not going to talk about it, you're a dictator, you're violating the Constitution, end of discussion.
Sam, I just think that's right. I think there's this almost like a trump card. You say, once you say somebody's a dictator, you really don't have to lay it out much, because I think they think his very election was giving the guy too much power. A lot of people on the right. Why has this guy got all this power? Who says he's president? Where did he come from anyway? Wait a minute, are you sure he's legal? And remember the guy I had on the other night? I don't know if you watch me every night, but I thought it was interesting on Hardball the other night this week. I had someone on, an activist, a local Republican figure, who's pushing this petition in Arizona to get rid of John McCain as some sort of lefty.
I saw this one,
And I asked him, I said, do you think this president was elected legitimately? And he said, I'm not going down that rat hole. I knew you'd take me there. Well, why do they have to insist on this most primitive approach to Obama, which is, he's not really president? And I'm not making this up, because you ask these guys, they could just throw it off the board and say, of course he's legitimately elected. Let's move on to policy issues. They don't. They say, I will not answer your question, because I don't think they go back to their crowd at home, wherever they are, people to the far right of them, and say they have to answer the question. Did you say Obama was legitimately president of the United States? How dare you say that? Anyway, was that too primitive to say that that's where they're at? That they don't want to accept him as president? Let alone executive orders.
I would say it's a bit of an overgeneralization, but I would also say that every bit of evidence, every shred of evidence suggests that the president has been pretty modest when it comes to executive action.
Well, how many people do you think I can get on this show to say, I'm not going to answer your question whether he's legitimate or not? How many will say, of course he is, and how many will say, I'm not answering? What do you think the percentage will be before you accuse me of overgeneralization?
I would have to ask your bookers what the percentage is that they've confronted. But
no, because we don't know. You are so all-wise, Sam. We don't know ahead of time what these guys are going to say.
What I want to say is this.
I'm always amazed, by the way. My answer, I'm always amazed at the number of them who jump right up and say, I'm not going to say he's legitimate. Thank you, Dana Milbank. Good thinking there, Sam Stein.
The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.